3, 2, 1. No.
No. This time out, I want to take a look at the other half of the creative team responsible for the bulk of what has come to be known as the Marvel Age of comics. We've already talked about Stan Lee, so it's time to take a look at Jolly Jack Kirby, the king of comics, and the man probably the most responsible for the look of comics today. Or, as Neil Gaiman points out, so much of what is magic came from Kirby. I'm Professor Jack. Welcome to Generation Geek. Jacob Kurtzberg was born August 28, 1917, and went through a lot of Jack names, like Jack Cortez and Jack Curtis, before finally settling on Jack Kirby, a name he would change legally later in life. A lot of the early comic guys did this, changed from ethnically sounding names to more mainstream ones, and Kirby was no exception. When asked about it, his response is that he wanted to be an American. He gets circumspect about the idea that being Jewish was the primary reason, but it's not a far stretch to figure that had something to do with it. Kirby made no bones about the fact he was Jewish, even if it was more cultural than religious. In fact, one of his best, most famous creations, Benjamin Grimm, the Thing of the Fantastic Four, is canonically Jewish. One of a very few heroes to openly acknowledge a religion at all, let alone Judaism. The Kirbys even used the Thing to illustrate their 1976 Hanukkah card. Imagine getting that in the mail some December. Anyway, Kirby, like the rest of the Golden Age creators, grew up in the time of the Great Depression. He saw his parents work hard. The difference for Kirby, though, is while he had a natural ability to draw, he was also a fighter, a scrapper. There was violence because, first of all, there were ethnic differences in names, he explained in a 1990 interview with comics historian Gary Groff. If you were small, they called you a runt, and you had to do something about that, even if there were 5 other guys. He continued, fighting became second nature. I began to like it, and I love wrestling. When I went into the Army, I took judo. Out of a class of 27, just me and another fellow graduated. There was nothing wrong with me. I loved it. Out on the street, Kirby could easily handle his own. Even outside the office, he was a tough guy. There's a story about when he was working for Timely, the company which became Marvel, and they were being shaken down by some gangsters about paying for towel service. Kirby went down and had a talk with them, after which there was no more problems. This was Kirby in a nutshell. He would go to bat for you. He would defend those who needed defending. Against the corporate overlords, though, those who signed the paychecks, he wasn't always so tough. But we'll get to that in a minute. In school, Kirby was, like most of us, a good student in the subjects which interested him, primarily history. He loved looking at the past. He also loved drawing and figured he could make a living at it, because I felt anybody could do that. All human beings have the capability of doing what they want, what they're attracted to. At 14, Kirby enrolled in the Pratt Institute to formally study art. He lasted about a week. Instead, he taught himself to draw, understanding he was never going to create classic masterpieces. I thought comics was a common form of art and strictly American in my estimation, because America was the home of the common man. And show me the common man that can't do a comic. So comics is an American form of art that anyone can do with a pencil and paper. So, pencil in hand, Kirby set out to understand the world around him and then figure out how to get what he saw, or what he imagined, on paper using any methods he could. When it came to anatomy, however, he had a very different approach, one which is partially responsible for his overwhelming influence on today's comics. My anatomy was self-taught, he explained. I made my own muscles, and I made my figures as powerful as I could. And when it came to perspective, the same simple reasoning held true. Explaining that if you're brought up in the city, if it doesn't look right, you'll know it. Kirby just assumed that everyone had the same natural talent he did. This was probably why, later, once he'd become more established, whenever a fan, wannabe artist would show up at his house, his wife Roz would make sandwiches, and Kirby would spend whatever time he could spare teaching them about how to draw comics. Once he realized comics was the way to go, he found work drawing strips for the daily syndicates, and then moved into animation, doing in-between work with the Fleischer brothers on cartoons like Popeye and Betty Boop. This is the grunt work to smooth out the movement of the characters. It takes skill, but not much creativity. Then he met Joe Simon. The two worked together for various packagers, creating their own characters or, more often, writing and drawing on other people's books, using house names. Until, in 1940, Martin Goodman, publisher of Timely Comics, needed a character to fight Hitler. Simon came up with the original sketch of Captain America, and he and Kirby collaborated on that now famous cover of Captain America Comics #1, where Cap is socking Hitler on the jaw. Suddenly, Kirby had a hit on his hands, literally and figuratively. Sure, the comic itself was a massive success, but that hit, the actual motion of Captain America slugging the #1 Nazi, that was a new thing. Comic art legend John Romita Sr. recalls when that issue came out, he convinced all the neighborhood kids to pick it up. He told them, "This is no ordinary comic where people are standing still and the dialogue is screaming. The drawing is screaming and the dialogue can't keep up with it. In all the other comics, the figures were standing straight up in the same poses on almost every page. Kirby made it a law in his approach that nothing was ever going to be standing up stiffly." Kirby said, "Captain America would try to fight 10 guys. I said, 'How do you fight 10 guys?' The fights in Captain America were very serious. If you look them over, they're real fights. I'd say, 'What happens to this guy while Cap fights the other 4?' And I would figure it out like a ballet. It would really be a ballet. That's why my book sold. Captain America was real. When Captain America got into a fight with a dozen guys, he could lick those guys, and anybody who read the book can see how he did it." And thus, comics were forever changed. Kirby brought that same sense of movement and kinetic energy to every character he drew, which, fortunately or not, was a lot of them. Kirby had a problem sticking with one thing. This is the reason he didn't last at Pratt and why he jumped back and forth between DC and Marvel and several other comic companies in between. He was always looking for something to challenge and push him. It didn't help that he wasn't a very good businessman, often settling for less than he was worth, and even though he had no problem using his fists, he had a hard time fighting for his right against the companies which employed him. Once he started working, and he and Roz had a family, it was more important to make sure the money, any money, was coming in. The sure thing was always better than the gamble. This led to Kirby, at times, doing 3 to 4 times as many pages in a month as the next most prolific artist at any company he worked for. When you get paid by the page, you make sure to get out as many pages as you can. In 1943, when he got drafted, once it was discovered he was the artist behind Captain America and others, he was sent to the European front as a scout, going behind enemy lines to literally draw maps of the enemy. Regardless of the danger, for the fighter and Kirby, this was a no-brainer, even though wartime frostbite nearly cost him the use of his extremities. Back in the States, after the war, Kirby reconnected with Simon for a while, then bounced around, freelancing on any book he could find. The early 60s found him back at Marvel, where his old assistant, Stan Lee, was now the editor-in-chief. And this is where facts get a bit hazy. Popular mythology, as mythologized by Stan Lee, is that Stan came up with the idea for the Fantastic Four after publisher Martin Goodman asked for a superhero group to rival the competition's Justice League of America. His wife Joan encouraged him to create the kinds of characters he always wanted to see in comics. And then he brought in Jack Kirby to draw and co-plot the book. Kirby's account is a little different, starting with the fact that he had created, or co-created, again the facts are a little fuzzy, a superhero group called Challengers of the Unknown 4 years earlier, 1957, for DC. That group, like the Fantastic Four, features a group of 4 explorers who miraculously survive something they shouldn't and then go off to explore the mysteries of the universe, both physical and metaphysical. It's not hard to see this as a starting point for the first family of Marvel. To complicate matters, Kirby tells a very different story of the origin of the group. I came in to the Marvel offices, and they were moving out the furniture. They were taking desks out, and I needed the work. I had a family and a house, and all of a sudden, Marvel is coming apart. Stan Lee is sitting on a chair, crying. He didn't know what to do. He's sitting in a chair, crying. He was just still out of his adolescence. I told him to stop crying. I says, go into Martin and tell him to stop moving the furniture out, and I'll see that the books make money. And I came up with a raft of new books, and all these books began to make money. Somehow, they had faith in me. I knew I could do it, but I had to come up with fresh characters that nobody had seen before. I came up with the Fantastic Four. Granted, this is from an interview long after the fact, after Stan had become the face of Marvel and received a lot of solo credit for work he did with other people, including Kirby. But at the same time, it seems odd for Kirby to refer to a man almost 40 as just out of adolescence. Kirby goes on in that same interview to take credit for creating every Marvel hit character from that time period. There have been whole books dedicated to trying to unravel this mystery of who created what and when. And while there is no doubt his contributions were, and continue to be, remarkable, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Even Stan Lee says of Kirby, he was the most imaginative, inventive guy I ever met. His imagination was incredible. The things he thought of. So even if he didn't do it by himself, Jack Kirby's imagination had a hand in the creation of the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Avengers, the X-Men, the Black Panther, Thor. And while the bulk of Spider-Man may have come from the pen of another artist, Steve Ditko, and we'll cover that in another episode, Kirby did the pencils for the cover of Spidey's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Kirby also had a hand in creating some of the best villains of the Marvel Universe, from Dr. Doom, see our episode on Doom for a complete rundown, to Galactus, to the Silver Surfer, who ended up becoming a hero in his own right. In fact, when Jack left Marvel in 1970 to move over to DC, he ended up creating one of their best villains too, in the form of Darkseid. Kirby's move to DC was an interesting one, and again sums up a couple of key facts about the man himself. First, it happened because he felt he wasn't being appreciated. Either, as we've just seen in terms of being given credit for his contributions, and that he wasn't being compensated fairly for the work he was doing. These were common complaints throughout his career, though. The second thing, for me, is much more telling, and again, there are conflicting stories about it, mostly from Jack himself. And it involves the first book he was going to work on when he made the switch to DC. The book was a Silver Age holdover called Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, focusing on the boy photographer at the Daily Planet. According to Kirby, the reason he chose that title was when he asked what the company's worst performing magazine was, they answered, Jimmy Olsen. I took Jimmy Olsen because it was a dog, didn't have the sales of Superman, and I felt the best way I could prove myself was taking a book that was slow and speeding up its sales. That's the way to prove yourself. And so I took Jimmy Olsen, and Jimmy Olsen became part of the series of books that I did for DC, and they all made money. Jimmy Olsen was making money. DC couldn't believe it, just like he did with Marvel a decade earlier. Maybe. According to others, though, the reason he took Olsen was because the book didn't have a stable creative team working on it, and he didn't want to take a job away from anyone. The combination of nice guy and egoist, fighter and team player. This is Kirby. While at DC, he did create Darkseid, which was part of his New Gods Fourth World series, intended to be his magnum opus. And if you read these books, available in collected editions, you can certainly see the grand vision and scope he was investing into these stories. Comic legend Grant Morrison goes so far as to call it Jungian. And you can also see how that scope influenced the science fiction powerhouse that is Star Wars. One look at Darkseid and Darth Vader side by side, and you can see a compelling case. Even the character's name, Darkseid, has become, thanks to that Lucasfilm, shorthand for turning evil. But if that's not enough, we can even look back at Dr. Doom, encased in protective armor to hide a serious disfigurement. Kirby himself was sure he had influenced Lucas, and again, saw it as someone taking credit for his work. But this is just part of the influence Kirby exerted, directly or indirectly, on the world of comics and science fiction. Disney chairman Bob Iger states it's really impossible to convey his impact on the industry because his work is still inspiring and influencing artists today. Taika Waititi, the director of Thor Ragnarok, is even more direct. Jack Kirby was a huge influence on the design of the film, he says, and you can see it in the lines and Kirby crackle Waititi used to decorate the backgrounds of the film, particularly on the planet of Sakaar. Furthermore, not only were the Jack Kirby Awards, 1985 to 1987, and the Jack Kirby Hall of Fame, 1989-2001, named in his honor, but he's also won all of the comic book awards which weren't, including several Alley Awards, a Shazam Award, and was one of the first people to be inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. Even 40 years after the fact, in 2004, in issue 511 of the Fantastic Four, the comic Kirby co-created to launch the new Renaissance in the form, writer Mark Waid and artist Mike Moningo quite literally make Kirby God, letting the Fantastic Four see their creator face to face. He's had an asteroid named after him, and the artists and writers working today all acknowledge his influence on their work. In fact, a couple of years ago, in 2017, on the occasion of Kirby's 100th birthday, Tomorrow's Publishing released a book called Kirby 100, filled with essays by the top names in the industry explaining the impact this one man made on them and what they do. I think we can end with the words of Neil Gaiman. Jack changed the world. And I'm really relieved to see Jack getting the credit on the movies and the credit for what he did and being brought back into the fold. So are we. The world would be a much poorer place if it wasn't for Jack King Kirby. I'm Professor Jack. Thank you for being part of Generation Geek. If you like what you just saw, remember to hit the subscribe button and click for notifications so that you'll know every time Generation Geek has a new video out. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media. We're there. And if you want to meet us in person, come check out Con Baltics this year. We'll see you there.